It's 5 o'clock in London, where we find ourselves today, midday in New York, midnight in Hong Kong, 2 a.m. in Sydney, 9 a.m. in San Francisco, and 9:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Patrick L. Young, the IPO-VID livestream, Series 31, Episode 4. That is episode number 184, and it starts here. As if there weren't enough worries already about resource allocation, now there's a kerfuffle about the ASX boss bullying her staff. Moving from down under to Germany, a rare comment from DB1 CEO Stefan Leitner, advocating for a pension shake-up with a soziale Kapitalmarktwirtschaft. It's time to end the pension Ponzi promise, ladies and gentlemen. Over in Miami, remarkably, it's 2025, and yet MIAX have just opened a new trading floor. That's in the heart of the Miami Design District and comes just a few weeks after their successful IPO. Meanwhile, in India, the National Stock Exchange have named Srinivas Injeti as its new chairman. Congratulations to NSE on the appointment of a blue ribbon formula regulator as chairman. And Srinivas Injeti also leads us, I think, ever closer to that IPO. The latest word from CEO Ashish Chauhan: we've still got one full human gestation period to go. I believe they're looking at 8 to 9 months. They're hoping to get the IPO underway. But for those of us who've been waiting for it for a generation, it's great to know that soon the NSE will be a publicly traded company. Our guest today, ladies and gentlemen, is Mel Dorman. The topic is Bank on Your Neighbor. First of all, let me say just a little word about where we are today. Thank you very, very much to the Intercontinental Exchange for hosting us today. Due to logistics, I was stranded in the City of London. They've kindly offered us the magnificent boardroom of their European headquarters. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, just over my shoulder, what you can see is indeed St. Paul's Cathedral, which means I'm right next door to what was once London's leading stock exchange, which is called the London Stock Exchange. Right, to Bank on Your Neighbor, ladies and gentlemen. Mel Dorman, our guest today, is a former social worker turned financial activist and author of the book Bank on Your Neighbor. In just 5 years, Mel has built herself an incredible, for want of a better term, change of life, a multi-million-dollar portfolio using seller financing, and now teaches others how to buy real estate without banks through her Seller Financing Academy. She's been a TEDx guest. She talked on decentralizing wealth, and that was selected as an editor pick. And her work empowers women. We're all in for that. Don't forget PhD with one. It is going to be tomorrow with the fabulous Jamil Navarrosa. Same time, slightly different channel, but on the same fundamental YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn portals. And Mel's work empowers women and communities to create lasting financial freedom together. Hear, hear, we say. What wonderful news all round. Mel, welcome to the show, Mel Dorman. Great to see you today. Where in the world are you?
I'm located out of Portland, Oregon, in the United States.
Portland, Oregon, in the United States of America. How absolutely gorgeous. And I'm sure it must be quite interesting. So tell us, a little bit about your background, because it's not every day we get a social worker on, or former social worker on this show. How did you get into social work? And then let's talk about how you got out of social work, I suppose. So how did you get into social work?
Well, I originally got into social work because during college, I started doing some sociology classes, and I started to realize that there was systemic oppression in the world, and I wanted to be part of the change. So I actually got into humanitarian work, and I used to work with women coming out of sex trafficking in India. And that was really my first taste of working with people on the margins.
Whoa, that is quite incredible. So how did you manage to do that, if you don't mind me asking? Because you're in Portland, Oregon now. Were you actually on site helping these women, or how did that work?
Yeah, so one of my undergrad studies was global studies, and we specialized in humanitarian work and international development work. So I just reached out to a local organization in Kolkata, India. They were helping women out of sex trafficking, and they basically provided alternative work to make handbags and t-shirts that we would sell all over the world at places like Whole Foods and other grocery stores. And that would allow these women to escape the trap, the debt that they were enforced in sex slavery in that neighborhood. There's 10,000 women who had been forcibly trafficked in that neighborhood alone.
Yeah, the thing about India is that while it puts on incredible growth numbers and amazing amounts of prosperity, the sheer number of people can lead to truly wrenching poverty. And indeed, I mean, not just poverty. I mean, the situation you're talking about is truly, truly appalling. And well, I applaud you for doing that. But obviously, therefore, life moved on. So what led you to go from that exciting existence into understanding real estate and becoming, if I may say so, a modest mogul in your own right?
Thank you. Yes. So I went from doing international humanitarian work, trying to help people out of poverty, only to come home to my own family about age 23. And my dad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And my family's blue collar, middle class construction workers. They were like most Americans, living paycheck to paycheck, and they had no savings. And so as a 23-year-old, I realized if I wanted to help my family, I needed to figure out how money worked. And so you can just imagine me working as a social worker in LA County Jail, processing inmates. And between inmates, I was reading all the top books on real estate and listening to all the podcasts, just trying to educate myself on how money worked and to build a portfolio. And so I was very fortunate to send out what I call love letters, which are just, looks like something your grandma would send you in the mail. And I started meeting my neighbors this way and developing relationships. And my first duplex that I got off market ended up coming in as the appraisal at $50,000 more than I was paying for it. And that's when I realized that real estate could really help my family out. But unfortunately, my dad passed away just after I bought that first duplex, and I was just devastated. And so I actually quit my job as a social worker with only $16,000 in my checking account at that time, because I had just learned about seller financing, and I felt totally emboldened to go all in as a real estate investor.
An intrepid tale of the West of the United States of America in many ways. You went all in, emboldened to manage to do this. I'm sorry to hear about your father. I think lots of us have had the problems of Alzheimer's in our families, and it is truly a terrible, terrible illness of the modern age that provides such a problem, because we see our loved ones diminish, and that's truly the heart-rending thing, as well as seeing them pass away. Yeah. So tell us, I mean, explain to us, we maybe not quite so financial laymen, but those of us who are in the audience today, explain to us how this whole concept of what you do works in seller financing.
Yeah, so most people are told you need to go get a bank loan and get pre-qualified before you go and shop for a home. I'm a top realtor in Portland, Oregon, and that's often what I do with my clients when I first meet them too. But what most people don't realize is if the seller has equity, you can actually pay them directly in installment payments. And what that does is it redirects those hundreds of thousands of dollars away from financial institutions and banks and back to a community member. And so each month, my payments were going to funding another person's retirement or paying off their kids' college. It's a neighbor-to-neighbor transaction, and it's how I built my portfolio.
So that's absolutely fascinating. So talk to me a little bit, first of all, about the mechanics of the deal. Because lots of people here who love their trade settlement, so you can't nerd out enough on that for some of our audience today. So explain to me, I mean, let's actually go all the way back. Let's go whole life cycle. You mentioned earlier on something about you found off market. I mean, presumably the deals you do are not necessarily the deals of what has arrived freshly in the window of your realtor's office.
I've done both. Sometimes properties are listed as seller financed, and I've found them off market using direct mail and cold calling. They're really available as long as you're looking. A lot of properties that are on market for a long time, especially triplexes, fourplexes, those folks are scared about the tax consequences in America for selling. They might lose hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so they're prime candidates for seller financing because it allows them to defer those taxes and make interest on that pre-tax dollars.
So that's very interesting. Okay, so essentially, I'm sitting on a piece of real estate, which presumably in this case, let's say theoretically, I bought probably quite a long time ago. I mean, pretty much before Mel existed. I would work on the presumption several decades and more. And then from there, I've now seen that property go up a great deal. So therefore, I'm exposed to capital gains tax. And one of the issues, particularly in certain American states, particularly the ones that seem to be out west, is some of them tax quite highly with capital gains on occasion. So, okay, so I would rather avoid that capital gain. So what does the deal look like? Do you give like a deposit, or do you just simply start paying installments? And then how does that end up? Are you paying amortization, or are you simply looking at like some sort of a balloon loan?
Yeah, so in my TED Talk, one of the things that I share is my first deal, which I think is really an interesting example of how creative you can get. So with this particular gentleman, he wanted 725,000, and at first he asked for 10% down, which would be about 75,000. But I didn't have that kind of money. I just quit my job. I only had $16,000 in my checking account. So I asked him if I could borrow $10,000 from friends and family to put in a second position lien, so that I only had to bring about $7,000 of my own money to closing, 5,000 for the remainder of the down payment, and only $2,000 for the closing costs, which is like very low compared to the banks. They're usually 10 or 12. And so when we got to the closing table, though, I realized that 2 of the units out of this triplex were vacant. And so I told him, well, how could I pay you if I have no money coming in? And so we agreed to delay the first payment by 2 months, which allowed me to recoup $6,500 of that $7,000. And that meant I was all in $500 on my first triplex, seller financed. And it cash flowed day one because we did interest only payments, which cut the payment down by about a third. So I had plenty of money to pay the first mortgage to the original seller, the second mortgage to my friends who loaned me $10,000, and money to take care of the tenants each month. And after 1 year, it was cash flowing $1,100 after I paid my friends off.
That is really, really fascinating. So how did you, I mean, I'm not trying to get the secrets of what you do per se, but how did you find this deal? What are the ways in which you can manage to discern who are the people that are open to seller financing? Because I think this is an alien concept, particularly to people in Europe or the UK.
Yeah, the most important ingredient for this partnership is that the seller has to have equity. So I reach out to my title company and I get a list of all of the homeowners, and particularly the small plex owners, 2 to 4 units. And I send out direct mail. I'll cold call them and introduce myself. I'll peruse forums on Facebook Marketplace for folks who have been trying to rent out their units for a while and they're struggling. I'll door knock to meet my neighbors, and I'll even tell word of mouth people that know me, hey, who do you know who owns their property outright? I would like to have a conversation with them. And so there's all these ways to meet folks who have equity. And on average in the United States, people who are 55 and older, they have a 52% equity stake. So there's lots of boomers out there right now who were around in the 70s and 80s when interest rates were skyrocketing at 17, 18% in the United States. And they have a working memory of seller financing because a lot of people were doing seller financing in the 70s and 80s to overcome that. So it's just finding those people in your community who have equity and an understanding of this model and creating a strategic partnership with them.
That's very interesting. And so ultimately, it does revolve around a certain amount of old-fashioned, semi-old-fashioned detective work, but at least Uncle Google and those sorts of things can be your friend in terms of finding out what goes on. But you got to do your research. You got to find out what goes on. So in your case, I mean, do you stick to one particular kind of property that interests you?
Yeah, I've invested in small multifamily primarily, so 2 to 4 units. I find that it's very efficient because there's only one roof for all the units. There's just an economy of scale built into it, and it reduces the risk when 1 of 4 tenants moves out versus, with a single family house. If one person moves out, then you don't have anybody paying the rent. So I've built my portfolio on 2 to 4 units primarily.
Very interesting. And in terms of the way that this is done, do you have a particular geography that you concentrate in, or how does that work for you?
Since this style of real estate investing is very relational, I recommend that people invest in their own backyard. So meeting folks in their neighborhood that they can develop a relationship with that's meaningful, versus, trying to reach out to other communities, sort of defeats the purpose because we're trying to build the social fabric through these strategic partnerships. And so I recommend in any economy, in any place, there are relationships you can build where it would be mutually beneficial because you're controlling the financing terms. So everything can cash flow, everything can work because you choose the interest rate and all the terms inside of the agreement.
And also, you have the advantage that you are close to the properties, which I think is something that a lot of people forget about. I mean, it is actually, if something goes wrong, you have got the opportunity to get into your car or truck or whatever it is and get over there. I mean, in some cases, you may even be able to use public transport in the wonders of Portland to reach houses, which is quite a lot different from a lot of people who end up with property at quite a distance, and then can find also the servicing costs and so on can get out of control, because at least you can have a relationship not just with your tenants, but with all the people who do the work.
Yes, absolutely. I have a team here that I rely on, a maintenance person, a leasing manager, and I really believe that real estate can be relational, not only in how we acquire it, but in how we manage it. And so I have personal relationships with my tenants. I give them Christmas gifts. I give them gifts when they move in. I'm there. I'm a part of their life in a way that, a hedge fund would never take interest in their tenants. And I think part of what's so powerful about seller financing is it really allows average everyday people access to become local property managers. And that relationship is key, because hedge funds don't care if a single mom lost her job. They're not going to work with her. But I'm somebody who let a situation like that, I'll let them burn through their security deposit while they look for a new job. And so it's that person to person care that I think is missing in a lot of our economies right now.
Yes, I mean, that can obviously raise a lot of issues for people when they do have those sorts of problems. But if you're on the ground, you can offer that sort of assistance to people. But tell me, has that ever burnt you in some way where people have abused your goodwill?
When I've not lowered my criteria on who can originally stay in the unit, I've never been burned. So as long as I've kept a high standard for the type of tenant, when they encounter a life circumstance, they understand that my needs matter too. And so, yes, they've moved out on time. But anytime that I've had a charity case where I let somebody move into a unit who wouldn't be necessarily qualified, it's been a nightmare. In fact, 2 weeks ago, or I guess last week, one guy returned who voluntarily moved out after threatening the neighbor. And he came back with a gasoline, tank to basically burn down the place last Wednesday. So yes, literally, I've almost been burned by a tenant who shouldn't have moved in the first place. But anybody who's passed my criteria, who's been a quality tenant, and they've had a life circumstance, we've always been able to work out a mutually beneficial situation where they move out voluntarily, but I've given them time to try to rectify the situation in advance.
That's very, very interesting. And certainly it can be very difficult getting good tenants as you go along. So tell me something else. I mean, as you're managing properties over the life cycle, how do you deal with issues like, I mean, obviously inflation is a thing, right? And you've got to look after your property and you've got to control and guard yourself, which I think is a perfectly reasonable approach and not unreasonable. How do you deal with tenants, rent increases, and so on? Do you have a general kind of formula with which you approach things?
Yes, as a former social worker, I really want to think about it holistically. And one of the values that I have as a social worker is personal autonomy. And so while it might be very tempting to just never raise rent, I also know that that creates a dependency between the tenant and the landlord. So instead of, trying to keep up with the peak of the rent, what I do is I take about $100 off, which allows a little bit of breathing room for my tenants. But as a property owner, I also know that if I give a steep discount, that's going to affect my property value. And so I don't want to create that sort of strange codependent relationship. And for those who are not wanting to raise rent or who feel bad about it, my recommendation would be continue to raise the rent, but then put that excess into an account, and you can always gift it to the tenant so they can use it as a down payment to get into their own home one day if you feel bad about that, without impacting the value of your property or creating a dependent relationship with that tenant.
That is very, very interesting. And I mean, so therefore, over time, you do tend to raise rent, but do you find that you raise rent more because of certain kinds of tenants?
I just try to get as close to market rent as I can without being right at market rent. It affects the value of the property, so it is important. And because I want to take good care of my tenants, I need to make sure that I continually cash flow. And so each year I do a raise, but I always check the data. I use a software here called Rent-O-Meter. I look at all the comps in the area, and I always just try to undercut my competition and provide a little bit of breathing room for my tenants. But yes, I do keep up with my rents. I think it's really important. I don't want to create a strange codependent relationship with my tenants like that.
No, I mean, that's perfectly fair. And I mean, for example, if you look at, well, some countries like France and Monaco, for example, most of their rent is actually indexed. So they have an index of rents, and you therefore know how much your rent will go up because they tell you the rental index, and you can see it, it's published like quarterly or 6 monthly, so it doesn't suddenly come as a shock as things are going along. You get to the end of the year and they just automatically put it up by that certain amount of money, which is quite logical. I have to say, on the other hand, it's interesting. I mean, there's a guy called Rory Sutherland, who's a very famous UK marketing guru. He appears on Instagram a lot, depending on where you look for these sorts of videos, or TikTok. And it's quite interesting because his father had an approach of never raising the rent if the tenant looked after everything. And what he meant by that was he would have not apartments, but he'd have large house or a reasonable sized single family home, as you would call it, with a garden, etc. And his view was that if the person really looked after the house and was actually proactively looking after it, then he more or less never raised the rent. And I've certainly had a situation, got to admit, this year with a fantastic tenants who we just absolutely love, who improved the garden. I mean, they went out of their own. I mean, they cleared a part of the garden, they improved it, they made everything work. And at the end of the year, it's like, well, you know, where that is, it's a 1-year tenancy agreement. And it's like, well, guys, do you want to stay? And it's like, well, yeah, we'd love to, but we're really terrified because no, I'm not raising your rent, because actually, if you continue to look after the house like this, eventually rent will go up. But like, you know, this is a guy who, when Tropical Storm Erin went through, he sent me what had been the damage to the fence at the front and said, look, I'm really sorry, I don't have a chance to fix this until the weekend. So kind of hard to really argue with that, I feel, but that may be because we're not in the heat of the US market, so therefore we don't have the same ability to refinance and so on. So that's very interesting, how you deal with your tenants, how you deal with your localization strategy and everything like that. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about Bank on Your Neighbor today, which is the topic of a conversation and also the title of a fabulous new book, There We Go, by Mel Dorman, who's our guest today. So tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah, so I wrote this book because I wanted to teach other people how to build these strategic partnerships in their community. So the first part of the book is really deconstructing a lot of the money myths that Americans hold that actually keep us stuck in cycles of poverty. And so deconstructing those myths, changing our mindset right before we head into the actual tool belt of how to do these deals, how to find people in your communities, how to strategically create a win-win partnership. And then the last part of the book is how to scale your portfolio using other people's money. So really community financed investing that benefits your community at the same time. And so the book really is a blueprint on how to do this. And I believe it would also be applicable in other countries, because most countries have a history of what's called vendor financing, I believe, as well. So it's US based, but I think it applies to a lot of countries.
Yes, I think it's quite feasible in a lot of countries, and certainly some countries have had interesting structures, such as France, where they've got those fabulous abilities where you can actually go in. I mean, that's a slightly different payment structure, but effectively what you do is you go and you buy the property of somebody, but then the difference there is you've got to pay a certain amount of money every month until that person dies. So they go from becoming the owner to the tenant. And of course, the great story about that is Jeanne Calment, who lived to be the world's oldest woman, I think 117 years old. She actually outlived the guy that bought her house, which was quite a singular achievement. I think some poor guy spent 40 years and then died in frustration. And he himself was about 70 or 75 years old. So he wasn't super premature, as it were, when he finally popped his clogs and went off without actually getting the property in the first place. I have no idea what the settlement is after that or whose estate it goes to. So there is some way to probably pick it up and keep paying. But yeah, you can have these risks, but you see that quite a lot in French provincial property. You can see quite often that for those who are feeling like they're going to live forever after a fashion of fame or whatever. So very interesting structure, interesting book. Tell us a little bit about it. What was it like writing? This is your first book, yeah?
Yes, this is my first book. You know, I didn't go to school as a writer, you know, so I really am a very self-educated person. I taught myself how to do real estate. So I put myself through a small program of reading about 20 books on how to become a good writer. And then it takes a lot of courage. So a lot of the personal development work that I did to make that big transition into financial freedom from being a social worker, I applied those same psychological tools to empower me to become an author and to become a leader in this way. And so it was a transformational experience. It really helped me hone in my messaging and helped me discover the bigger impact of seller financing, which for Americans is how we can redirect wealth away from Wall Street back into our local communities through these strategic partnerships.
I think it's very interesting when we talk about it. I mean, one of the things I would also say, though, is surely that, I mean, America is intriguingly financed because in Europe, roughly, I mean, in America, I think if I remember correctly, I mean, really 80% of the banks are only really doing sort of like 20% of all known financing. So you get an inverse Pareto principle. So there's a lot of other financing alternatives out there. Whereas, you know, Europe, for example, is quite the opposite. I mean, Europe is essentially bank dominated. I mean, effectively, you're seeing 80% of all property transactions, et cetera, are bank financed. So there's probably an even bigger opportunity, which seems rather ironic, given the fact that Europe's always the place that says that it's anti-bank and anti-capitalism so often that it manages to end up with the banks being so dominant, which is quite intriguing. But tell me a little bit, I mean, extrapolate this for me. Okay, the community economy, as you look at it, we've got, yes, you're keeping the money in the community because you're, you know, our old financial word that we all really, really love and get off on, disintermediation. So you're taking out the bank from the transaction, you're paying your money directly back to the person who owns it, et cetera, et cetera. You mentioned a lot about building the community financing. How does that overall benefit society? What are the other ways that spin-off grows?
Yeah, so when I think about this, you know, most real estate transactions are just a moment in time, and the buyer and seller never even meet each other. There's mediated by two realtors, and there's sort of this built-in idea that we should be afraid of the other party. And that social distancing is why we're being taken advantage of in a certain sense. That's why we believe that we shouldn't interact with each other. But when you take down that trust, or when you take down that fear and you build trust and you realize that, you know, it only costs $15,000 in Oregon in order to foreclose. So as long as I'm paying my seller more than $15,000, they'll have money to foreclose on me if I shouldn't pay. So there's a built-in security there. And so I think as people make these partnerships together, we start to build an investment literally in the other person's life, because I want to make sure that my payment is you know, going towards their retirement, and they also want to make sure that I'm cash flowing so that I can keep paying them. So it's not a moment in time transaction, it's actually an investment in one another. And I think that restores our social fabric. I think it also moves us from what's called a shareholder version of capitalism, which is corporations and big banks and all that, back to a stakeholder version of capitalism where we care about all of our constituents when we make decisions. That's why I care about my tenants when they lose their job and that sort of thing. So it's really a returning to a model that is much more human and person-centered.
It's wonderful. I must say, I'm summarizing the sort of the idea of, I don't know if you've got a car or a truck, but you driving through the streets with the truck with people doffing their caps in your general direction as the wonderful person who enables this commerce. And I mean, it is a very, very interesting and positive thing. So can you tell us about some of the spin-offs? I mean, have people been particularly engaged in this model that they've come back to you and given you feedback, or helped other people or themselves become vendor financiers as they go along?
Yeah, so this year I started the Seller Financing Academy, and I was trying to get about 10 students just to test the pilot program out. I ended up getting 57 students who wanted to join the program. And so I have a robust data set now of folks who have learned the material and then immediately started implementing it in their own lives. So as an example, my girlfriend didn't know anything about seller financing. She sent her first 100 love letters, like I was saying, to reach out to local sellers in the area. And within 2 weeks, she's already in conversations with 2 elderly women with about 7 properties collectively, and they are very interested in seller financing. They've read my book, they're listening to my TED Talk, and they see the value of creating these community partnerships. And so it really is not even very difficult, especially with my book and my TED Talk, to talk to people about buying their homes this way. I have other clients who, you know, they never dreamed or imagined they'd be able to buy a 10-plex, and now they are in contract. And today we're actually going to have a coaching call putting that deal together and kind of ironing it all out. I have another student who took $40,000 of her home equity and turned it into $45,000 of passive income in 6 months by doing 6 partnerships like this. So different students have taken it to different levels, but it's very exciting to see the imagination start to grow for what's possible when we partner with people who are actually in our community.
It's fascinating. That's quite incredible. And you've talked about how you scale this and how you work up. So tell me, I mean, is there a finite limit to what you can do in terms of how many deals or how many multiplexes or whatever you can actually manage to realistically own?
You know, what's so cool about this is when you control the financing and it's between you and another person, you can do some amazing things. So that triplex I mentioned that I bought with just $500, a few years later, interest rates dropped. So my 5.5% interest rate didn't seem that appealing anymore. And so what's cool about seller financing is you can move debt from one property to another strategically. So I called up those sellers in 2020 and I said, hey, I know I owe you 700,000, but could we take that one promissory note, that's the contract, that mortgage, and can we divide it into two, one for 350 and one for 350? And they agreed. And so I moved one of those pieces of debt and I collateralized it on other pieces of real property that I owned, duplexes, another triplex. And that left a lot of equity in the subject property. So I did a cash out refinance, paid them off 350, took out 205,000 as a down payment on a 20 unit in Ohio. And so I took that $500, bought a triplex and expanded it to 23 units total. So that's the power of seller financing. You don't need a lot of money. It's just a social relationship. Social capital is what it's built on.
Fascinating, quite fascinating altogether. What about the overall level of administration and time you have to take up? I mean, presumably, eventually you reach a point when you're talking about 30 or 40 plexes, however you want to look at apartments, that takes rather a lot of time just to administer. I mean, just to do your taxes, to make sure that the utilities haven't fallen into disrepair or something like that. You know, just checking that everything kind of works. And occasionally, the way that things happen, you know, plumbing can go wrong or whatever you have to do to help your tenants, depending on where you are. What's the sort of scale you can manage out of that?
Yeah, so most professional property managers will be managing around 100 units. I've consolidated my units down to 16. I sold that 20 unit a couple years ago and downsized. And so I'm only managing about 15 of my own units right now, which takes about 5 hours a month. It's the most highly paid 5 hours a month I make. And yeah, it's actually it's not that hard. And for folks who do struggle with it, I just recommend they use a professional property manager. So that way they're not trying to balance maybe a corporate job with tenants' needs, because it's very important to take good care of our housing and our tenants.
Understand. So you can manage to do that with that number of units on sort of 5 hours a month or something like that. What about the deals themselves? I mean, it obviously must take you quite a lot of time to actually source each deal.
Yeah, so I've been a top realtor for about 8 or 9 years. So some of these deals I just saw on the RMLS, which is like where people find homes, on Zillow or Redfin, or if you're familiar with those. And the other ones I just would passively be putting direct mail marketing, about 50 or 100 letters a week. And so one of the things that I teach in the Seller Financing Academy is how to create that automated direct mail marketing campaign, where you're just constantly 50 letters each week, which gets the phone ringing, and then you can meet with people. So once they're calling you, they're a pretty viable lead, and it's just about developing a friendship with them and understanding their unique needs, and then presenting an offer that's custom tailored to fit exactly what they are looking for.
Wow. Well, we are here, ladies and gentlemen, discussing Bank on Your Neighbor, the cracking new book, which is out, written by Mel Dorman. I'm going to let Mel have a rest for a couple of minutes so she can sip some water and be prepared for the next part of the program. Let's move across to that time of the show when we show you our little big world reel. So let's have one of our short videos that have been out during the course of this month. And I think we should look to the skies above. Meanwhile, in Big World, continuing our post series about the world's busiest airports, it is an interesting Middle Eastern route within Saudi Arabia. Jeddah to Riyadh is the 6th busiest air route in the world. Tokyo Haneda to Naha is the 7th. Mumbai to Delhi comes in as the world's 7th busiest air route and India's most frantic, while Beijing capital to Shanghai Hongqiao is the 9th. And finishing a brace for China, 10th is Guangzhou to Shanghai Hongqiao. Very interesting to spot those top 10 domestic routes. For more in Big World, like or follow. So there you go, some interesting statistics. Don't forget, of course, there's that fabulous South Korean route, which is the biggest of them all. Our books of the week, we're still catching up with stuff that we had during the course of the summer when IPO-VID was on holiday. But don't forget, of course, well, the pace of the world of bourses is relentless. Thanks again to the Intercontinental Exchange for hosting us today in ICE Futures Europe's wondrous headquarters here. As we look behind us too, well, a magnificent piece of real estate that's certainly not available for vendor financing, St. Paul's Cathedral, where indeed our King Charles went for his first wedding all those years ago. Margaret Thatcher was buried. Winston Churchill was buried, and so on and so forth. Anyway, August 16th, our book of the week then was Messina's Federal Budget by Christopher Messina. A couple of times he's been on our show in the past. A very interesting discussion about just how, well, federal financing might manage to get itself slightly better under control. You can catch that via Amazon and other sources. And of course, if you go to our website, you'll be able to pick up a copy without any difficulty by just clicking and pointing your credit card in the right direction. August 23rd to 29th, you can do it by the same process of acquisition. That was the complete book of options, spreads, and combinations, again by one of our former IPO-VID guests, Scott Nations, a handy reference guide for using option spreads and other common sense option strategies. So going back to our conversation today, ladies and gentlemen, let me say, first of all, thank you so much. Maybe it's because our guest comes from Portland, Oregon, and we know that Portland is just a place where everybody is much, much more kind of chilled and manages to spread the love much easier. But I'm really, really happy. We've got a few likes already for this show, but give us more, because you know what? AI needs likes, ladies and gentlemen. It's one of those strange things, those bots, in order that we can manage to get this message out. And it's inspirational, ladies and gentlemen, talking to Mel Dorman, banking on your neighbor. If you got a question, query, anything like that, join us in the show. We'll welcome you, even if you just want to make a comment. So Mel, tell me, in terms of this whole strategy of vendor financing, is there a finite limit to which it's going to be able to scale up in the near future? Because you mentioned about, you know, all of these gens that have basically, they bought in the 1960s, 70s, wherever. Obviously, tragically, they're not going to live forever. Is there going to be a limit because people aren't going to have equity in their homes in the relatively near future?
Yeah, so, you know, COVID was a big boost to appreciation. As a top realtor, we saw after we printed $1 in $5 in the United States during COVID, we saw, you know, appreciation rates jump to 25%, go figure. And so there's a lot of folks right now that do have equity, and we're facing what's the silver tsunami of folks who are going to be retiring and dying and handing off the largest transfer of wealth our nation has ever seen. And so really there's this window of opportunity that we could take charge of. And if we built these strategic partnerships, then we'll keep that capital in our local communities. But if we don't, then yes, banks will continue to be funding and financing our loans. And the more share that they have, the more that wealth is extracted from our neighborhoods. So it's a really amazing opportunity right now to get into seller financing while those folks are actively aging and ready to let go of their portfolios.
So that is a very interesting point. So the opportunity is better than it's ever been right at this point in time. We can't say what it's going to be in the future, but right now you have this amazing transfer of wealth issue. Tell me something. Have you ever thought about looking at ways to do the same strategy by acquiring things like family businesses, or have you always just stuck to real estate?
Yeah, so you bring up a really great point. So Cody Sanchez is my, you know, the person who is the influencer around buying businesses through this model. And she's a big advocate of that. That's not my lane, so I won't speak to it. But yes, you can do vendor financing or seller financing on small businesses. And again, the same principles apply. It's about cutting out big financial institutions, banks, corporations from continuing to franchise and sort of turn our economy into this shareholder economy. But she's encouraging this mom and pop shop purchases so that you can continue to be a local owner of these small businesses.
Yeah, very interesting. I agree with you. She's totally inspiring, Cody Sanchez. She's the OG of inspiring us all to look towards the laundromat economy and a million other small businesses that can really provide an incredible return, but also, let's face it, are fabulously important for community integrity. And that's something which I think we have lost in the age of massive multiplexing of absolutely all known business, which does not result in local economy investment, which is a fundamental problem that we see, and a failure, let's face it, of failed up capitalism in recent decades. So it's very, very interesting that we find a better balance. So Tell me a little bit about yourself. I mean, what are your goals for what you want to do with your portfolio?
Yeah, with my portfolio, I really have a mindset of enough. You know, that I think a lot of real estate investors, there's this like grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. And at the amount of units that I have and the amount of passive income I have, I don't need to work for the rest of my life. And I think that's enough. So what I've done, you know, at age 35, I reached that six-figure financial freedom, about $180,000 passive a year. And I decided to pivot rather than expanding my portfolio. I decided I wanted to focus on reach. And so I spent a few years really thinking about the angle of my book and how I could strategically reach people who were progressive, who were marginalized, you know, people of color, trans, non-binary, queer, folks who don't usually get access to financial literacy books because they're not written to them. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about how to bring this particular message to people who I think would use it for really positive change in their communities.
That's a very, very interesting concept, and I applaud you in every possible way. I also have to say, if you don't mind my saying so, which is probably me showing that I'm definitely generation entirely aged and sexist. I can't believe you're 35, actually, but it's a wonderful thing. So maybe you can share your skincare regime as well with all parties, transgender, whatever, whatever AMAB, AFAB, etc. It could be quite lucrative for you as well when you get on the chat show circuit. And I'm not trying to be sarcastic. I genuinely think it's inspirational altogether. And tell us, you've reached this in what, 5 years of hard work at what you've done?
Yeah, so from the time I quit my job with $16,000 in my checking account when I had just learned about seller financing to the time that I had 34 rental units was 5 years. And I even went through a pretty rough divorce during that time, so they weren't all easy years. But simultaneously, while I was building my portfolio, I was also building a top realtor team in Portland. So I had a lot of access to deal flow. I was supervising a lot of different agents, and I was deep in the trenches of real estate, just constantly buying the next property as soon as I could afford it.
Fascinating. So tell us a little bit about your realtor career. Did you actually go into being a realtor simultaneous to deciding to try this strategy?
Yeah, so I realized very quickly after quitting my job that I needed to have some sort of income. So I got my realtor license. And at first, I was just using it as a way to do these transactions for folks who were facing foreclosure. So it was a lot of, it almost felt like social work, trying to help people to avoid the auction. And then selling those properties to different business partners. It was just deep in the trenches. It felt a lot like social work. So eventually, after 1 year of doing that, I decided I would just want to, you know, start partnering with Zillow, get these sales calls coming in, and I'm just going to build a real estate team. And so that's what I ended up doing. And I built a team that most agents would have taken about 20 years to build, and I did it in about 2 years. And I had a lot of coaching in that process. I didn't come up with the concept myself, but I was very proud of how quickly I was able to scale a realtor team.
And in that realtor team, I've got to say, I've got to ask you the sort of $1 zillion question, which is obviously you talked about diversity. How diverse is your team?
Yeah, it was very diverse. We'd have, you know, a lot of queer folks, women, people of color. Even there's kind of a joke. My business partner is a white heterosexual male, and our first employee was actually a white heterosexual male. And so when we went to hire our third employee, they said we need to get a woman because there's no women here. You're the most masculine one on the team, Mel. So we decided to make sure that we included more women on the team, and we pretty much hired women after that.
That's fabulous altogether. Top tip, of course, the easy way to do that, I always find, is to try and employ not one person at a time, but employ at least 2 or 3, because then you always end up naturally balancing through the process because you make sure that you pick whoever that is. Having said that, as our team and our fabulous production team will know this evening, it's lovely to have you with us this evening, Kim, Natalie, and Herminia. The issue with my team is actually that I'm a complete failure at diversity altogether, but not in the way that most people might expect of a pale male, still white bloke. So moving from our own corporate travails of having an absolutely brilliant team who are all female, what do you see is going to be the future for what is going to happen with this deal structure? I mean, do you think that we've got like 5 years, 10 years or longer where it's going to be absolutely frenetic? And does it then just die out?
In terms of seller financing, I mean, it has predated the mortgage industry. It's just that most Americans aren't aware of it, and that it's kind of in these silos of real estate investing, business ownership and trade, and really farms and rural areas who don't have access to bank financing. And so it's always going to be there, but whether or not the general public has understanding of it, my personal mission is that every person in the United States know that seller financing exists. So they don't necessarily need to do it. It might not be a good fit for them, but I want them to know it just like they know what the term organic is or fair trade. I want them to know that there's an ethical way to redistribute wealth back into our communities, person to person, through seller financing.
I have to say, when you compare yourself to fair trade, I'm almost inclined to say, don't be so hard on yourself, given some of the foibles of fair trade. Sorry, I have to say that it's a wonderful idea, but not necessarily one that exactly ends up where everybody would hope it would be. And actually, speaking of which, we have our commodity doyenne, so she can have the final word on fair trade in a minute if she wishes to. Coming to us from Chicago, Anne Berg, herself a great multiple-time guest on this show and has been a panelist as well. Your smarts and sheer gutsiness are so impressive. Thanks for a much needed bright story. Also, a great sub point actually here from Anne Berg to you, Mel. The social component reminds me somewhat of Islamic finance, which I think is a very, very interesting parallel that I haven't drawn so far. Thank you, Anne, for that, because there is something here which looks very similar to classical Islamic finance, itself a multifaceted approach. Thank you so much, Anne Berg. It's lovely to hear from you this evening, and we really appreciate your comment. Maybe you've studied Islamic finance or taken an interest in it.
I have a really interesting story about that. One of the reasons why seller financing is so important is it creates accessibility for folks who wouldn't ordinarily be able to qualify for a bank loan. And one of those subcategories are folks who are Islamic and are adhering to their religion very strictly. They can't pay interest. And so a few months ago, I got a call from a seller who had a duplex and a triplex that she'd inherited from her mom. Her name was Cynthia. And I met with her as a listing agent to maybe sell the properties. And I remember telling her, I think your duplex is worth $550, but how would you like to make $610? And her eyes lit up, and I knew the properties that she owned them free and clear. So I said, if we offered financing, the buyer pool would open up significantly. And if you did interest only payments, your payment would be much less than a bank loan. So you'd be very competitive, even at $60,000 higher, or roughly 10% more. And so she was very excited, and she said actually she knew who would be able to buy it. Her tenant, his name was Abdul. He was Muslim, and he was a doctor, and he made $350,000 a year. He was very well qualified otherwise, but he can't pay interest. So I called up Abdul and I said, would you like to buy a 0% interest loan and buy this duplex? And he said, yes. So I said, how many years would you like to buy it over? And he said 7. So I just got out a calculator and I added what would have been the interest to the purchase price. And he did a 0% loan for 7 years, and it funded Cynthia's retirement, and he was able to buy a property of his own. So it's really powerful what you can do with seller financing to overcome these gatekeeping standards that banks haven't caught up to modern day realities.
That is a magnificent story. Really, really interesting. Most impressive. So I suppose I've got to ask is, are there any impediments to the whole process of seller financing?
Yes, one of the biggest impediments is when somebody has an underlying mortgage. So if they don't own the property free and clear, then you have to deal with that, because most mortgages have what's called a due on sales clause, which means when you transfer ownership through seller financing, that underlying mortgage needs to be paid off in full. Otherwise, it becomes due in 30 days. So imagine getting a $100,000 or $300,000 bill from a mortgage saying, you owe this, or we're going to foreclose on you. So you have to deal with that underlying mortgage, and there's a few ways to do that. The easiest way is to replace one small bank loan with another small bank loan, and then the seller can finance the rest, which is very simple. But there are a few other strategies that are in my book as well if people want to learn about it, but you have to deal with an underlying mortgage correctly.
Fascinating. Really, really fascinating altogether. And I suppose going back to, what you're talking about here with the Islamic finance side of things, I must admit, I have no idea what the population of, say, for example, Portland is in that regard. But presumably there are a lot of areas of the USA which have got enormous opportunity to go more down what effectively becomes a bespoke Islamic financing concept if you can find the right seller match. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're a great demographic for it. A lot of them are very responsible, have jobs. They're just blocked out of the system because, banks require you to pay interest.
Yeah, well, I mean, the banks are rooted in their particular way, and I don't know if particularly Islamic banking structures have taken hold in that in the USA. There are some I know that are offered Islamic banking mortgages through some of the Islamic banks in the UK, for example, where we are today, courtesy of the Intercontinental Exchange at their European headquarters. So, look, I mean, it's a fascinating strategy. It's a fascinating approach. Is there anybody who should not be looking at the idea of seller financing?
Yeah, so one of the things that I offer in the book are the green and the red flags of seller financing. And so one of the a few of the red flags would be if they didn't have any equity in the property, they couldn't really finance you. If they are looking to continue to be a landlord and maybe they want to do what's called a 1031 exchange, which is a US tax law that allows you to sell one rental property and buy another one in a short amount of time, and you don't have to pay the taxes. They wouldn't be a good candidate if they were wanting a big lump sum at closing. Maybe they had a big bill they needed to pay, a medical bill or something like that. If they need all the cash at closing, they're not a good candidate. And of course, if somebody is not able to understand the contract, don't do elder abuse, basically. Make sure that somebody is able to comprehend what you're talking about. So those are some of the red flags of it doesn't work for those folks.
That's interesting. But at the same time, what you're saying is the pool of people for whom this process can work on the seller side or on the buyer side is pretty much a vast multitude of the populace of the United States of America, and provided the laws allow it, the population of the world.
Yeah, yeah. If you've ever seen a mortgage statement or close on a house, often it's like $500,000 is the price of the property and $600,000 is the amount of interest that you'll pay over those 30 years. And I imagine a world where we start to pay that 600,000 to our neighbors instead, and what that could do for our communities. And while it seems like a very strange concept, 90,000 people did it in the United States last year alone. So it's already happening. It's just happening in these niche communities who are selling in rural areas or who are selling as investors, because investors understand this concept quite well.
So that's very interesting. So you say there were roughly 90,000 transactions in the USA last year. So that's, a fraction of 1% of the total number of trades that take place in real estate in any particular year for single family homes and multifamily units. What interests me from that is what's the limit to what this can potentially do? I suppose it's just driven by how many people actually want to get involved and how many potential, particularly silver surfers, are going to be selling into that market.
Yeah, I've heard some statistic that roughly 5% of people have to change for an entire movement to happen, and so it is a decent amount of people still that we would have to get to do this, but I think it's quite possible. It's on every single real estate form across the United States. When you're selecting what type of financing, seller financing is always an option. And so I think if I can infiltrate my fellow realtors by giving speeches and providing this book as a resource, I can slowly start to change the tide, because realtors can really be the ambassador of this change. They're already sitting in the living rooms of sellers. They're already providing these options. And since the market is so tricky right now because of high interest rates, it really gives realtors a strategic advantage, because they can provide alternative financing options that can open up the buyer pool and help sellers sell in a difficult market.
Very interesting and very good point. And into that, I suppose I'm quite interested in the whole concept with the deals. How do you look at the actual terms? Do we know, is there a particular sweet spot, for example, of how long the loans tend to last, or are they simply a vast multiple of things all the way from relatively short term to near infinity?
Yeah, because it's just an agreement between two people, it's really structured to meet both of their needs. And so I've seen folks who do 2% down, 2% interest rate, and 20-year loan. That made sense for those folks because they had a child who was receiving it, who was on Social Security, and if they received too much interest each month, they would get knocked out of that program. So that, while that doesn't sound like a great deal to you right off the front, it is a really great deal for that particular seller. I've seen folks who do like a 6-month, and they're just partnering with the seller in order to do a quick renovation and sale, and it's almost like a joint venture agreement. So the seller's making the money that would have ordinarily went to a bank, that house flipper's just giving it to the seller. I've seen folks, 5 years, 10 years, it's all negotiable. And really, when I'm thinking about it, I'm very happy to offer a higher than value price as long as I have a long term ahead of me and it cash flows off the bat. So if I'm not having to put a lot of capital in, if it's got a great interest rate and it cash flows, I'm happy to overpay, because over time that property will increase in value, and that extra that I given the seller up front will be sort of, cannibalized, and the appreciation will do all the heavy lifting.
And also, therefore, let's just talk about that. I mean, fees. You've sort of mentioned a couple of times around about fees, but obviously that is a huge part of real estate acquisition and cost. How does this transaction impact the overall fees from the realtors all the way through to what we would call in Europe the stamp duty, or whatever it is you have to pay in terms of purchase tax at completion?
Yeah, so if you're using an escrow company, you're still going to have to, do prorated taxes and insurance. Those are. It's very important to use an escrow company. You want to know if the title's clean, if there's a true transfer of the property. I wouldn't recommend getting rid of that. Depending on the level of somebody's financial literacy, if they have a lot of experience in buying properties, they could also bypass the realtors if they find a seller directly in their community. But I also encourage a lot of people to continue to use a realtor, because they're there for a purpose. They can help mitigate a lot of risk and walk you through the whole process. But the real savings here is in the underwriting. Banks will charge $10,000, $12,000 for closing costs on a house that's about $500,000, which is our median price in my current community. Whereas a real estate attorney is going to charge $1,000 to $2,000. So there's a $10,000 savings right there, just not having to pay a bank underwriter. Of course, the seller can hire a mortgage loan officer to underwrite it and to let them know if they think, the buyer is suitable. You can hire that professional as well, but it's still going to be a lot less than you would pay a bank to do that.
That's a very, very interesting point. And obviously that's great, because that is more money that goes straight into the community rather than going to the large mortgage corporations, etc., which is quite fascinating. So unfortunately, we've reached that point in our discussion, and I wish this conversation could carry on, Mel. And actually, I'd love you to come back someday and tell us what it's been like to be on the road. Join our panel in a few months' time when you take your book out and get on the road and see what sort of feedback you're getting. I think it'd be a really good conversation. Actually, you might be able to get onto one of the panels with Anne Berg herself, which I think could be really, really useful. But we've only got time for the last question. As always, let me ask you, Mel Dorman, where do you think the capital market revolution goes next?
I think it goes back to our communities. I think in a lot of ways, we've grown so large in our populations, we've become very distanced from one another, especially in the Western world. And I think there's a big desire for community, and there's a big desire for interdependency. And so I think the capital market revolution is going to be a return to community and helping one another, and recognizing the significance of those direct partnerships. So I think it will become neighbor to neighbor.
Neighbor to neighbor, end to end, ladies and gentlemen. Watch that for the next kind of peer-to-peer transaction. It has been a joy chatting with you, Mel Dorman. You are a true force of nature, a real inspiration, and it is a joy to chat with you today. And I wish you all the very, very great success with your book, Bank on Your Neighbor, and also the opportunity to hopefully chat with you again in the future. Show us that book. Available now? Already in shops? Excellent.
Yeah, Amazon.
Head to Amazon, go there, get that copy of your book as soon as possible. Start looking at seller financing. Thank you very, very much for the question, Anne Berg. Thank you so much for a smooth operation today. First of all, to our hosts, the Intercontinental Exchange, really, really appreciate that, the guys. All those people who sent us love, it's not too late. Do send us a little bit of love at the same time. And of course, let me say huge words of thanks to our fabulous team today, Herminia, Kim, and Natalie doing everything in the back office. It only remains for me to say, my name is Patrick Young. If you'd like to build yourself a marketplace, don't forget, you can always get in touch. Don't forget to catch up with us also on Exchange Invest at exchangeinvest.com if you're interested in exchanges. Next week, we've got a fantastic show. We've already recorded this one, and it is a gem. We're talking about another new book that's out, The Carbon Paradox. It'll be launching next week at UN Climate Week. That will be IPO-VID 185 with a returning guest, the great Steve Zwick, Renat Heuberger, and also Marco Hirschbrunner. Don't miss that next week, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for watching. I wish you all a great week in life and markets, and I'll catch you in Exchange Invest in the meantime. For now, from London, and indeed from Portland, Oregon, it's time to say goodnight. Have a great day. Have a great week in life and markets.